So if the United States and many other countries are corporations, corporations that operate like crime syndicates, what does that mean? I want to explore that idea. What is a corporation? I think Thomas Jefferson here is providing us with a historical perspective based on observation when he says that I believe that the banking institutions are more dangerous than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their rights. And to some extent, I think he's talking about a company or group of people authorized to act as a single entity. He has this very much in mind, the legal definition. But notice here that a corporation is granted its legal rights as a person by a monarch or a parliament. In other words, it's a transition of power that we're speaking of from a world dominated by monarchs to a world of a new kind of corporate power that he envisions usurping all other powers. Jefferson clearly saw this usurping of power as a historical watershed. The transition of the right and sovereignty of the king to the legal personality of a corporation, to the goals and the objectives and the sovereignty of the king, to the rights and the mission statement of the board of directors. And here's where we want to do a little bit of digging and ask ourselves, what does a board of directors do? What is their mission? Corporate profits? I think in Jefferson's mind it was something much more than corporate profits. I think he, like Hamilton, saw it as the future of a sort of empire. In Hamilton's mind, it would be a commercial empire, but Jefferson's painting a darker vision, where this new life form will sort of devour everything from the previous world, in his mind, everything that was good, and become something altogether different. So as we're juxtaposing the difference between the power of a corporation and the board of directors and a chief executive and the responsibility of the political realm, we can think of also the relationship between the human and the non-human entities that are given life here. So the two kind of legal entities we have today are the natural persons, or a physical being, and a judicial person, which is treated under law as if it were a person. Now, this didn't come about whole cloth, but it was a process. And it was a process that mostly occurred through the legal system. In the United States, it mostly occurred on a case-by-case basis through the branch of the Supreme Court, as we will see in a moment. So Jefferson is picturing a process where slowly something that previously had no life is given life and will usurp the life that gave it life. And I know that sounds sort of far-reaching at this point, but work with me for a moment. Before we continue, though, bear in mind that in the old world, the life of the king as an entity included the life of the subjects. So what we're driving at here is, as the corporation takes the life of the old world, it takes the life, the liveliness, the lifeblood of the whole body politics with it, And I think that's what Jefferson is getting to when he talks about the corporation and the banks usurping the liberties and the prosperity of the people. But here we see that the legal personhood of an individual comes about when they're born, whereas a judicial person, it comes about when they are incorporated. And this is an interesting word here, incorporation. It's the formation of a new corporation. It's a new type of life recognized as a person under the law. The corporation could be a business, could be a nonprofit organization, a sports club, a government, or a city, or a town. And I will add here that this can go on ad infinitum. If it can be a city or a town, of course it can be a nation state. And if it can be a nation state, it can be a series or consolidation of nation states. In fact, by its definition, it's an evolving process that a corporation, in fact, could become a world federation. And that's where we're going with this. And that is what Hamilton and Jefferson saw as the future. Hamilton's painting a happy picture of this, Jefferson not so much. And I don't think they're working from raw speculation. Both were privy to the plans of the banking elite, and we're painting two different sides of this managed dialectic. Jefferson, however, I think paints a more accurate picture of the 21st century, whereas Hamilton perhaps painted a more accurate picture of the 19th and the 20th century. But this is what we mean when that the U.S. is a corporation. And if the U.S. is a corporation, that means in a sense the whole nation-state system has been incorporated. And when we're thinking about it in the terms that we are now, we have to ask ourselves, does the life of the corporation necessarily have to extract the life of the body politics? And I think when we look at the direction of the world over the last 200 years, the answer to that is an unequivocal yes. And if this is a bewildering picture of the world, we might ask ourselves, is there anything that can be done about it? And this is the whole concept of the deep state, the invisible state, the corporate state versus the visible state, the politics. And we ultimately have to decide who is in control. Is it the Congress and the President, or is it the board of directors of this corporation? And again, let's dig a little bit here. The board of directors is recognized as the chief corporate directing entity of the corporation. It's given its powers through its own constitution and bylaws. In a non-stock corporation, a city, a state, or a federation, voters are excluded from the process. That is, political process is null and void. The board of directors is the supreme governing body of the institution. And membership and the directorate within that membership is chosen inside of the board itself. So what are the ramifications from this? Well, the control mechanism has been hermeneutically sealed, blocked off from the body politics. So although the influence of this is broad, what can be done about it is very limited. And this was recognized by William Domhoff, who was especially focused on the concept of interlocking directorates. And when we think of the world in terms of the cave paintings that we're given, we oftentimes think of a world of free competition, where different entities struggle against one another for profit in a competitive marketplace. But Domhoff is going to focus on the idea of interlocking directorates. It's almost like a sort of complex of sorts, where everything is interconnected and not exactly as we would see the world. But he notes in his interlocking directorate article that way back over 100 years ago, Justice Louis Brandeis noted even then that only a few large corporations were essentially beholden to the investment banks and controlled all other corporations. So this is kind of different from how we picture the world. We think of corporations being competitive with each other in a marketplace where they're competing for shares. But when we focus on this idea that has evolved from the time of Jefferson to the progressive era 100 years ago until now, what we see and what can be tracked is an increasing concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands, and the hands that we're speaking of are those of the board of directors that have the decision-making power across many different companies and corporations, across many different nation states. So we're talking about transnational decision makers that through corporate control, again, let's think of the two nodes of government, or more precisely, the two nodes of power inside of the deep state that we've discussed before. That being the stock exchange, which thrives off global profits and militarism, and the security apparatus inside of Washington, D.C., or inside of any other national capital. So is it any surprise that we seem on an inexorable path toward globalism and increased militarization? In fact, Domhoff is very helpful here, and this is from his article, this illustration. Look at the center of this diagram. That's Citibank. That's one financial house, and those key directors from that banking institution essentially control the destiny of all these other corporations. And just note the size of some of these corporations. We're talking about Halliburton, AT&T. Read them. They're huge. They're huge. And we can even take this one step further. And bear in mind, again, all these corporations are international. This is going to have legs on it. That's only the first tier. There's a second tier and a third tier. This is truly a monster that reaches every crack and crevice throughout the world. And the hands that can control these destiny of what a corporation does, how it acts, how it behaves, is in the hands of a very, very few people. And I think the average person doesn't really have an adequate picture of this. So please just absorb that if you can, if you will. And the bigger question here is how we as individuals, as quote-unquote citizens, how we're able to see but not see. What do I mean by that? This is oligarchy. This is our form of government. The reality is so different from the paintings on the wall that are given to us by television and in the schools. And we learn about these things in the schools, but we just can't hook it together. And this set of cases here combined give us the slow surge from what was left of a Republican form of government in the early 19th century to what is an all-out oligarchical form of government today. And we hear it, it's in the air that Citizens United 2010 sort of put the nail in the coffin, that any realistic, honest thinker can see that when money equals freedom, especially the freedom of mind, that Jefferson's vision of what would happen by allowing these private bankers to control the money supply, and that the corporations that grew up around them would slowly usurp the freedoms of the people, the prerogatives of the people, and make them their own. And this is where I'd like to suggest a broader picture of what's happening. That yes, this is all about corporate profits. And yes, it's even about world domination. But there's a spiritual component at work here. And by way of analogy, I want us to think about this corporate empire of sorts as connected to the idea of a golem, or a golem project. And a golem in Jewish folklore is an animated, anthropomorphic being that is magically created from innate matter. This is Kabbalistic in nature. It's part of the great work, giving life to something that has no life in order to fulfill a grand spiritual destiny. There are many differing tales on how the golem was brought to life and afterward controlled. The concept of a golem first occurs in the Bible. Psalm 139:16. It says, "My light form," material connotating the unfinished human being before God's eyes. Both the Talmudic and Kabbalistic tradition, it is often used today as a metaphor for an entity that was created, that exists, that is managed, that is under the control of man, or more likely a master, or even more likely a master race. And this entity that is given life needs to be controlled. Its perceptions need to be managed. Otherwise, it can become hostile. And this hostility is repeated over and over throughout the oral tradition of the Golem. The oldest description is connected to Rabbi Shalom, a Polish Kabbalist, who reported the creation of a golem. He had heard that the creature was made out of matter, and it performed hard work for the rabbi for a long period. There are competing accounts of what happened here, but ultimately the rabbi deactivated the golem. He removed it for a certain reason, and it turned to dust. Ashes to ashes. But bear in mind, and this is a critical part of the tradition, that the first man, Adam, was made from the dust of the earth. And so the rabbi here, and the tradition of the golem, is usurping the role of the creator to make life from inanimate form to serve the master. critics of this banking aristocracy and the corporations that would exist among them, all the way from Jefferson to Jackson, envisioned it as a sort of monster. Generally, it was a serpent or a leviathan. But I thought that the analogy of the golem was helpful, partially because both the golem and the corporation came into the world at the same time. So by way of analogy, I'd like us to look at the birth of the corporation that was given life, that especially being the East India Company. Initially, it was designed to go east. The East Indies at that time were more specifically what we would today call Southeast Asia. But ultimately, it would conquer China, the Indian subcontinent, and the whole world, putting the sovereignty of each nation into private hands. But the story isn't quite that simple, because over time, the relationship between master and servant, or master and monster, would grow hostile. And maybe it's helpful here for us to revisit the story of General Cornwallis and his surrender to George Washington in 1781. And it's important here also to remember that he was the director of the British Indian Company. He helped establish the Corporation of India, Ireland, and we'll see here, the United States. So on the surface, what appears to be the diminishing of the British Empire and the creation of a republic, when we dig a little further, we see it was the creation of a new kind of corporation, sometimes called the Anglo-American Project. And I think it's helpful here to dig into the Act of 1786 that was enacted by Earl Cornwallis, sometimes called Lord Cornwallis, that the powers of the Governor-General be enlarged to empower him to override the majority of his council and act on his own special responsibility. The act enabled the officers of the General Governor and the Commander-in-Chief to be jointly held by the same official. This act clearly demarcated borders between the Crown and the Company. After this point, the Company functioned as a regularized subsidiary of the Crown, with greater accountability for its actions, and reached a stable stage of expansion and consolidation. They achieved a state of truce with the Crown. The Company continued to expand its influence to nearby territories through threats and coercive action. By the middle of the 19th century, the Company's rule extended across most of India, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and British Hong Kong, and a fifth of the world's population was under its trading influence. So here we see that the creation of the modern world, the modern quote-unquote political world, was established specifically through corporate charter. far from being a surrender of power by Cornwallis, we see a transformation of power, a shifting of the historical tide, the birth of a new kind of monster. Which brings us back to the Golem, and the most famous account to date that occurred in the late 16th century with the Rabbi of Prague, who, in order to protect the Jewish community, constructed a golem and brought it to life through rituals and incantations. The golem was said to make himself visible and summon spirits from the dead. Some versions have the golem eventually going on a murderous rampage. The rabbi then managed to immobilize him in front of the synagogue, whereupon the golem fell in pieces. Which brings us back to the fate of that other monster lurking in the east. By 1803, at the height of its rule in India, the British East India Company had a private army of about 260,000, twice the size of the British Army. However, it would be dissolved by the India Act of 1874, and the official government machinery of the British India had assumed its governmental functions and absorbed its armies. So what does all this mean? What is the historical watershed? Well, what had happened here is this oligarchical power, the financial aristocrats that Jefferson spoke of, going to transition themselves from the visible role of conquerors to the invisible role of perpetual usurpers, usurpers of the king and the lifeline and lifeblood of the subjects therein. Through control of the money supply, business would create the dialectic of war, funding and abetting both sides in each conflict, which would spill over into the dialectic of politics, funding and controlling both candidates in every democratic election, but ultimately about controlling the perception of the subjects therein, projecting the image on the cave walls. So the Indian East Company, that monster that we've discussed, had transformed itself into what we see today, the legs of interlocking directors. World control in the hands of very few. And those very few people at the tippity top are the people that control the money supply. No big secrets here, but what we're demonstrating right now is how this historical watershed went from their visible power of conquest through colonization to transforming that back underneath the crown, or in the case of the United States, beneath the power of the presidents and the representatives in Congress. So we have the height of that power with the bubble in 1782, and we see the death and reemergence of the corporation, demonstrated as the corporations of a life, of an idea. But here we did, by analogy, the life and the death of one monster into another, as represented by the story of the And in this way, we can see the Empire project as an extension of a more mystical, a more spiritual project, the Golem project. And again, the project is about economics. It is about domination of the world. But more importantly, and I know it's hard to get our heads around this, the Golem project has always been, in Kabbalistic lore, the spiritual destiny of mankind through managing the dialectic of the master-slave relationship, the endgame, apotheosis, godhood. Through a dialectic of a master-slave relationship that begins with business, a business that creates war, in which politics is the window dressing, and the masters of business, the masters of war, and the masters of politics work in tandem as puppeteers to create the images for us on the cave walls. And woe be it to those individuals to walk to the back of the cave and see the light of the sun. Because at that moment, when they see the interlocking relationship of business, war, and politics, they truly see the objective nature of good and evil. And their victory is their own. It will be a victory that will not be celebrated with those inside the cave, but it will be a victory that will be celebrated with the true Creator, the true Master of both heaven and earth.